Hey guys, welcome to the next lecture in the lighting section of this course. In this one we're going to go over the sun lamp. So as you can see, I've started off with the same scene we had last time for the Hemi lamp, and we're going to pick up right where we left off, and I'm going to show you how to keep going. So as you can see, I've still got my Hemi lamp here. Now I could delete this and create another lamp, or I could just come over here to the lighting panel and switch this from Hemi to sun. So if I switch this to a sun lamp, it's going to try to take all my settings from this Hemi section, basically my color and my energy, and put that over here. So let's start with a clean slate. You can switch these, but let's go ahead and get rid of this. And I'm going to go ahead and add a lamp again. Now I'm going to pick sun. Now that's going to change all the settings back to default. And again, I'm going to move this up. Now that doesn't matter where it's at, because again, just the rotation is going to change what we see. So let's rotate this a little bit, so we're going to get our light coming from down and to the left when we look through our camera. And let's just render this the way it is. Okay, so we can see that the light is definitely coming from the upper right hand corner down to the left, and leaving some nice shading here with some pretty harsh shadows under here. So again, nothing looks really that different from the Hemi lamp other than the kind of harshness we're getting here with the contrast. But you're going to see that the sun lamp is quite a bit different. So again, you're going to see the same settings here for specular and diffuse, on and off, and then energy and color. So let's change this a little bit more of a red tone there. I'm going to lower this down to like 0.8 just to take some of those bright highlights off. Let's re-render this and see what this looks like. Okay, so nice starting point. Now let's talk a little bit about the sun. The sun is going to add light to your scene that tries to emulate light that is the sun in the real world. So in both the Hemi lamps and the sun lamps, the light rays are parallel because the light rays are received from such a faraway location. That's not the case with the lights we're going to talk about later on. So you have to realize that parallel light rays means that shadows for sun lamps have one set of rules, while every other type of lamp casts shadows with a different set of rules. So let's talk a little bit about how we can tweak our sun lamp and add things like shadows. One thing we're going to talk about first is sky and atmosphere, and this atmosphere down here. Now, I'm not going to use sky and atmosphere. Basically, it will try to automatically generate a sky for you. And then it's going to add some atmospheric settings in here that you can change. Instead of doing this and going in here and tweaking these presets, we're not going to have a background. And the reason for that is because we've modeled this nice studio setup that is going to be in the background that receives shadows in a soft way for us. So we're not going to have a background. So we don't need to turn this on. Instead, I'm just going to turn on atmosphere. Now what this does is it tries to simulate the atmospheric haze that exists in nature, and it will naturally reduce the contrast in the light and shadow areas on your scene as objects get further and further away from the camera. So let me show you what that does. I turned it on, and if I just render it now, you're automatically going to see a little bit of a difference. So I'm going to change this to slot 1, and turn this off, render this, and then I'm going to switch back to slot 2. So can you see if I switch between these renders? The difference is this is atmosphere on, this is atmosphere off. So with it on, the shadow areas are going to get a little color added here, and the image gets overall a little more red because of the scatter settings. And there's also less contrast. These aren't as dark as they were, not by a lot, but they are a little brighter than they used to be. So if we change these settings, we can change the brightness of how the sun is perceived based on the atmosphere. Also, we can change how far away we have to be before this fall off turns the contrast down. So if I re-render this, you're going to see, let's change this down to like 0.6. That gets darker. If we go up higher, maybe crank it way up to 6. You can see it gets a lot brighter. And again, this is all going to change depending on how far away we are from this fire hydrant. So right now, bear in mind, we created a camera that was 100 millimeters focal length, and we're at a certain distance. So if I render this, I'm in slot 2. Let me switch back to slot 1. Now let's do something interesting. Let's take the camera, turn the focal length up to 300, which will zoom in automatically with a higher focal length. And then let's move this camera way back to where we are kind of in the same framing. Now if we render this again, you can see it's a lot brighter in these shadow areas. And the reason for that is because Blender thinks we're a lot further away from this fire hydrant. So even though if I switch back and forth, the framing is pretty much the same, you can see that the haze really changes depending on your distance away from the object. So bear in mind, it's not just your light settings over here. It takes into account where your camera is. So I'm going to undo that to where we're back at our regular focal length of 100. And let's go back into the light settings. Let's talk about shadow. This is going to allow you to turn on shadows right down here. You can either have it set to no shadow or ray shadow. Now, ray shadow is going to bounce light rays around the scene and calculate cast shadows for the sun lamp. So all I did was check that off. Let's render it and see what happens. Okay, now right away, we're getting cast shadows definitely, but it's really harsh. So let's talk about how to change that. One of the things you can do automatically is take this shadow here. Now it's automatically set to pure black, and most shadows, unless your exposure is set to a setting on your camera, are never pure black. It's a little ridiculous. So if you bring these up to somewhere around there and then re-render, you're going to be able to see a lot more detail in these shadow areas. If you keep upping this to like here, those shadows are going to get even less intense. Now they're still intense, and part of that's just because it's a sun lamp. But let's talk about some things we can change. For down here, samples will increase the quality of your shadows overall. This is going to change how soft they are. So 0.1, you've got a really harsh shadow. But if I change this to 1, and then I re-render, you're going to get a little less harshness. Let's change this to something way bigger. Let's go up to 10. Okay, nothing's happening. The reason is because we're still set at sample 1. So if we change this to even 3, you can see that made a huge difference. Now, samples are good. They're going to give you more bounces around the scene. They're going to increase your quality of your shadows, things like that. I'm actually going to bring this down to like 3 again, just so we can see a little bit less. So that's more realistic. The problem with the samples is you're not going to get rid of this noise unless you really crank this up. So if we go to like 32 and render, now the noise is going to be a lot less than it was, but your render time has gone through the roof. So as you can see, this is real time. I'm just sitting here waiting for this to render. And this isn't a long time in the grand scheme of things. It may take a lot longer to render your actual scene. But if you're testing stuff, this is, you don't want to be sitting here over and over again, testing this over and over again with these settings. So my advice to you guys would be to keep your samples low when you're first trying things out. Don't worry about the noise. You can always get rid of the noise. But keep this down to something below 12 if you're going to be test rendering. And it's going to allow you to quickly see what's going on with your lights without, and that's not a ton of noise I can't handle. So let's change this back to, I don't know, 6. See what that does. So again, some nice shadows here. And be aware, it's going to change the softness depending on how far away the cast shadow is from the object that's casting it. So up here, where these shadows are falling on this, you've got a pretty sharp fall off here. But because the cast shadow here is coming from this stuff that's a lot higher up, it's a lot blurrier, just like in the real world. So pretty handy. Be aware that samples and soft size are what we're going to use to change how that works. Now, these two options will change the kind of ray sampling you're using. Adaptive is faster, but it's also noisier. Constant is less noisy, but it's slower. So if you change this, we may or may not see a difference in the noise. but be aware that if you cranked these samples up, you would definitely see a difference in the noise patterns at some point. So again, keep it on adaptive if you're test rendering. If you want to do a final render, you might switch it over to constant and see if you get a boost in your quality. But you know, it all depends on what you're after. So that's about it for the shadow settings. So before we move on to the point lamp in the next lecture, I'm going to show you some of the settings you might use to kind of make this a little bit more, you know, like a sunny lit day. We're going to add in the atmosphere again, change the energy back here. And one thing to note too is everything you're seeing is dependent on where your sun is rotated. So if I have this sun rotated only slightly off straight down, you're going to see some really harsh shadows. You're going to see lighting like you would see it at almost noon in the day. So if you rotate this down to here, bear in mind the horizon is going to be somewhere wherever this intersects going parallel. So that could be 7 or 8, that could be dawn, you know, somewhere around there. So if you want some really nice sunset lighting or some lighting you'd see at sunrise, change that angle to something extreme and then re-render. And so there you go, perfect example of a sunrise. Let's rotate this around so we're not getting the shadow behind it, but instead off to the side. Let's do that. Render it again. So some nice, really nice fall off there, especially with the atmospheric haze. Again, you can change this to like purples and get some nice stuff going there. And then always add some more intensity with this. Now, atmosphere will also change the amount of scattering within the environment itself. And to get more into how these things work, you need to understand how scattering within the atmosphere actually works. And part of that's just about how much red and how much blue is showing through because of the stack of atmospheric haze that you're seeing in the scene. So I'm not going to get into this a lot, but if you do toggle those values, you're going to see a little bit of a difference. So if we re-render, you can see that I can really quickly come in here with just one lamp and add some really nice sort of cinematic effects here. And again, if you want to crank this back down, you're not going to have to get so much of a blown out image. You can get some nice contrast again. And so that's about it. For those of you who are very serious about mastering lighting, you should take the time to study lights in the real world and experiment to see what types of effects are found in nature and also in man-made lighting, which we're going to go over next. This will really help you increase the realism of your scenes tenfold when you know when, why, and how to use the lights to give your scene a specific look, like this sunset look here. So in the next lecture, I'm going to cover settings for the point lamp, and we're going to get into how to generate lights that are not found in nature but are man-made. So I'll see you there.